Oh, hello Internet. This is the summary video for Hannah Arendt's What is Authority? And again, this is going to be long enough and it will miss quite a lot of details. So see the earlier deep dive or read the essay. The question, what is authority, is answered early but then explored at considerable length. Arendt starts by saying that authority in the West has ended. This is not to say that governments do not exert power, nor that power is exerted only with violence, but it is to say that Western governments' perceived legitimate power has been undermined and could collapse at any moment. Arendt claims that the Roman political trinity of religion, tradition and authority has collapsed in that order, but only with the fall of authority have we noticed politically. This loss leaves us politically adrift and allows the nucleation of powerful narratives and chaotic ideologies. These are totalitarian cults, which begin from a small core of egoistic certitude, a person or a small cabal, and expand outward in layers. But this is not true authoritarianism. Arendt draws a political spectrum between authoritarianism, structured by hierarchy, and egalitarianism, which is structured by persuasion. And then she claims that coercion, structured by violence, is a confounding factor on that spectrum, which distorts the simple calculus. It is only under coercion, then, and not authority, that tyranny and totalitarianism can actually occur. Arendt spends part 1 talking about the political confusion that has arisen around authority in the modern age, that is, since the 17th century. First, she chooses to make 3 distinctions which she believes are definitely important. These are that religion is not faith, that tradition is not the past, and thirdly, that authority is not the human capacity to build order. Unfortunately, I think that the third of those is both the weakest and the most important, but in any case, Arendt makes clear that such distinctions as these are important, and that modern discourse tends to overlook this, allowing us to engage in discourse without having convergent definitions. This is politically ruinous, as then only the argumentative process can determine the winner, which sounds reasonable until you realize that even if you catch your opponent in an invalid argument, then you do so on the basis of definitions that they did not agree to and which you have not demonstrated to be correct in the first place. Such distinction-denying theories are common. Liberals and conservatives tend to make critical conflations. With regard to freedom, liberals tend to conflate authoritarian, tyrannical and totalitarian forms of power, and so they begin to equate all power and restriction of freedom with violence. Conservatives, on the other hand, will argue that freedom can exist only because of its boundaries, and that the removal of these boundaries will lead to some kind of relativistic free-for-all, and in this way they begin to conflate egalitarian and democratic systems with their own kind of tyranny and eventually totalitarianism. With these conflations in mind, both liberal and conservative theories become excessively focused on restoration of their preferred aspect, either of freedom or the protective restraints upon it. And this becomes, over time, a zeal to see that restoration made perfect and the opposition utterly expunged from political life. This irony can start a totalitarian slippery slope to the left or the right. Arendt spends considerable time in part 1 on a schematic form for authoritarian, tyrannical and totalitarian governments as a pyramid, a destroyed pyramid and an onion, respectively. The pyramid of authority describes a hierarchy in its gradient. This hierarchy is lost in the destroyed pyramid, where only the apex and the base exist, and then totalitarianism is rendered as a central core around which layers form. The core is the most radical, and then its ideas dilute as they expand out into normie space, so to speak. The onion is qualitatively useful, but very different from either of the other two, so I took the liberty of making the destroyed pyramid the totalitarian authority of the centralized core over the polity, and then the tyrannical ruler, with this same urge to concentrate power, pinches the top of a pyramid to make it closer to their goal of this absolute power. I went further and played with a spectrum that went all the way to the inverted destroyed pyramid, but you can watch the original video if you want to see that, and I do not make any claim to legitimacy of my model any more than I do about Arendt's. These are, as ever, illustrative metaphors. These conflations continue in another distinction-denying theory, the functionalization of political concepts. Both liberals and conservatives tend to accept that whatever fulfills the function of something is that thing, and the political case is that if authority is what makes people obey, and violence can make people obey, then violence is authority, and, by implication, authority is violence. Arendt claims that anyone who describes tyrannical systems as authoritarian is making this conflation, but that liberals and conservatives go on to make different uses of it. She's most suspicious of the conservatives in this case, not because she believes that they are more wrong, but rather that she believes they are more likely to take the step of utilizing explicit violence rather than political pressure. And this is obviously true to this day. Change my mind. Both sides, though, she says, agree on the fundamental assertion that authority is what makes people obey, and she remains cautious of accepting this. It is, after all, the very thing she seems to try and find a substitute for in a world where authority has faltered. Arendt claims that her models and the schematic forms that she uses are ahistorical and anti-functional, which are two assertions I'm not sure that she can fully back up in this essay, nor are the schematics particularly compelling on their own without further evidence. It seems to me that she is on the firmest ground with her casting of the political spectrum between authoritarianism and egalitarianism, and then the relegation of coercion, and therefore violence, to the role of a non-political disruptive influence. Authority is thus that which enables society to function hierarchically, but does it make people obey? Arendt concludes part 1 with the question she hopes to address by the end of the essay. 1. What are the political experiences that correspond to and give rise to authority? 2. What is the nature of a public political world constituted by authority? And 3. What changed about the world when the modern age began to undermine the tripartite model of religion, tradition, and authority? Returning to the root of Western authority, both Plato and Aristotle tried to formulate political authority from more practical examples in real life. They discard the model of the tyrant driven by private whim and the model of the military commander in a short-term emergency. This leaves them with models derived from the family and household and from the craftsman. This provides us with the basic dichotomy of Greek authority, categorical authority versus technocratic authority. The first one is when a category of agent has the natural right to rule over another. And the second one is when a certain level of expertise inspires the confidence in their rule. However, neither model is recommended in its pure form. Aristotle leads more towards categorical authority, Plato is more technocratic, but there is still some cross-pollination between the two. Plato's political authority is derived from the parable of the cave in the Republic. The philosopher, seeking only the light of truth, leaves the cave and witnesses the sky of ideas, gaining a wisdom that is greater and more true than anything that exists in the shadowy human world of objects and individuals. However, returning to the cave, the philosopher finds themselves unable to communicate what they have seen and blinded by the gloom. They fear physical danger from their fellow humans, and it is only now, in fear of their lives, that they turn to the ideas as standards for the adjudication of human affairs, and so use the beautiful ideas to create good laws, according to their own judgment, that is. Arendt observes that perhaps only Kant saw that just because they are able to use the ideas in such a way, it does not mean that they are automatically correct to do so. Must we accept that what the philosopher sees in the sky of ideas is appropriate for the human realm? Perhaps, though, in the end it was Plato's trauma at the death of his mentor Socrates that caused him to see this conflict between the philosopher and the polis, and thus inspired him to introduce a political aspect into his strictly metaphysical philosophy. Arendt gives Plato the benefit of the doubt and says that he was aware of these issues but was unable to extricate himself from the technocratic craft analogies, some of which, like the shepherd and the sheep, lean more categorical. The problem with craft analogies is that the process of fabrication always involves violence done to the raw materials. Plato's most successful analogies were taken from the interpersonal sphere, ship's captain and passengers, or doctor and patient, leading to a model whereby the rulers were merely accessing the ideas in forming a plan they were creating, and then the ruled carried out the necessary instructions. They did the making, and therefore any unseemly fabrication that needed to be done. So rulers were thus exempted from violence, which is nice, but there was still a kind of coercion implied in this process, especially seeing as the ruled were not themselves privy to the sky of ideas. In the Republic, Plato recommends the myth, an afterlife of rewards and punishments to make men behave as if they knew the truth. But in his final work, The Laws, he takes a different approach. If the rulers can use the ideas to regulate human affairs, then, like a craftsman's blueprint, the model for these regulations, in principle, exists prior to any real person beginning to work with them. Plato could thus institute the laws as the despot of regulation, and so every human, rulers included, was beholden to the laws specifically, and all were then, to the extent the law allows, free. This was an obedience in which men retained their freedom, and the hierarchy that emerges from this, with the philosopher king at the top, naturally, was thus clear and perceptible to anyone who would make the effort to see it. And this was the final piece of Plato's puzzle, the need to see. He took it as a given that all humans are only human insofar as they desire to see clearly, whether this be the sky of ideas or the shadows or the objects in the cave. Plato connected this clear sight with clear understanding, as opposed to anything that might come after it, for example, speech and action in the human world, and he thus concluded that those who are concerned with seeing and understanding stand rightly in authority over those who are concerned with speech and action. This is the root of the Platonic exaltation of the vita contemplativa over the vita activa, which would dominate Western philosophy for the next 2,000 years. So Plato began this dichotomy vitae, the pure contemplation of the philosopher in his solitude against the messy world of human affairs and the masses. However, even though this dichotomy is most powerfully expressed in the parable of the cave, it is not actually dependent on the doctrine of ideas, because it depends on another concept which Plato mentions in the Theaetetus, and this is the concept of wonder. However, true philosophical wonder and its attendant drive to understand, and subsequently control, the world is not something that everybody has the ability or the inclination to do, and it is therefore only the few who are capable of doing it. These few are able to determine correct insights about the world by their superior sense of wonder, and so they are living in a totally different type of life, as a totally different category of human in a way. Aristotle made this the distinction between the bios theoretikos and the bios politikos, which is similar to the vita contemplativa and activa, but without the doctrine of ideas and without the philosopher king. It's more complicated than that, obviously. Arendt says then that it was Aristotle who first appealed to nature for authority, a categorical distinction between majores and minores. But what is it that distinguishes the two? There is undeniably a technocratic flavour of expertise, but primarily, before any political life at all can begin, Aristotle says that the few must have conquered necessity, that is to say, found a way not to have to worry about biological needs at all, by whatever means they deem necessary. The calculus is to say that, yes, the field of biological necessity absolutely accepts violence, but the subsequent political realm where actions are taken is above that kind of base behaviour. If you're not hearing many 21st century standards here, then you're right, but equally, it doesn't impose any -4 century standards either. The question is only on whether you think that authority in a political sense rests on something more akin to Plato's model or to Aristotle's. These are the two Western paradigms, and the dominance of the vita contemplativa prevented serious attention from being paid to any alternative structures. Arendt does discuss the possible risks of a new model, or the transition to it, at the end of the essay, but any new model does need to offer a solution to the Platonic predicament of violence. Arendt accuses Aristotle of several inconsistencies with more egalitarian descriptions he has of the polis, but the biggest problem for her is that his metaphor of youngers and elders is unsuitable as an analogue. Young and old are distinguished only by education, which is pre-political and thus should never be a standard for the political realm. Aristotle's example, though, is still relevant because the necessity for authority is more plausible and evident in child-rearing and education than anywhere else. Arendt's position then, echoing the Romans, is that political authority can be educational in character only if we assume the primacy and infallibility of the ancestors, at least in the sense of their being abstractly great. The heart of Roman politics is the sacredness of foundation, and auctoritas comes from the Roman concept of augere, to augment, and what is always augmented is the foundation. This event had religious significance for the Romans. The founders and ancestors were the icons of this system, and elders, by virtue of being closer to the foundation, had a claim as rightful bearers of this authority, tying the tradition back to its foundation. However, Arendt notes that authority is not power. While power resides with the people, authority rests in the Senate. The key distinction then is between the auctor and the artifex, and here the previous efforts of Plato and Aristotle are brought into the Roman model because the Roman reverence for foundation looked to the Greek forefathers as ideological ancestors. The auctor instigates the augmentation, and the artifex fabricates the augmentation. In the Roman view, it was more praiseworthy to be the progenitor of an idea that augments the culture than to actually bring that augmentation about, and so it is not works and deeds that are worthy of the greatest respect, but the sage advice that counsels them. Once again, this seems to accept the primacy of the vita contemplativa shown by Plato and Aristotle's educative process from inherently worthy ancestors in deciding what augmentations are appropriate. Arendt tries to claim that this advice is not a command and so does not fall into the master-slave dynamic, but I'm not sure if that exactly holds up. In any case, what is true is that all humans, layman, expert, or philosopher king, tend to attribute credit for a success more narrowly than the effort required to produce it. This is the fickle nature of what we call greatness. In a new visual metaphor, Arendt compares the tradition to an inverted pyramid which grows through time from the foundation. The Roman concept of authority is the gravitas which acts like a ballast, keeping the ship of state on an even keel. Although we did note that if the metaphor functions as shown here, then the ship of state would be sailing perpendicular to the arrow of time and not necessarily into the future as such. It was in this political context, though, that the Romans found a reverence for tradition, religiously connected to the foundation, and building a respect for authority. This is the first political model in which founding fathers are respected as pseudo-religious figures, but not the last. The problem with this model, which becomes more pressing over time, is that the foundation mythology of the state is derived from the wisdom of the elders, just as Plato's concept of the philosopher king is derived from the hypothetical witness of the sky of ideas, and as the continuing political process which gives rise to authority becomes more remote from the foundation, then we will lose sight of the political experiences that enabled it and inexorably fall into dogmatic modes of behavior. This leads eventually to the failure of the space of remembrance and the fall of the political realm. But the Western thread of tradition did manage to survive the Romans. How? Well, because the Roman Catholic Church, through its own founding fathers like Tertullian and Augustine, installed the Roman political trinity into their operating system and allowed the so-called miracle of permanence to occur again. This required a new spiritual foundation, the death and resurrection of Christ, and the emulation of certain aspects of the Roman model. For example, the Pope, or Pontifex Maximus, assumed the authority of the Roman Senate, allowing the princes to maintain worldly power. The success of this transfer is undeniable, but it contained the seeds of its own downfall, because as the modern world fatally undermined the Christian worldview, this began to destroy the foundation of authority itself. Secularization's attempt to remove authority from the hands of religious systems revealed that now, if authority was no longer bound to the Christian foundation, then there was no foundation for authority anymore, and this is what led to the fall of the final pillar of the Roman political trinity. This amalgamation of Greek and Roman concepts in Christian authority formed the basis for all Western authority over the medieval period. As the Roman Empire collapsed, the Roman Catholic Church assumed responsibility for the secular realm, with all princes tacitly or explicitly acknowledging the Church's moral framework. But as we saw above, there is a difference from the Roman model here. The Roman political trinity is a trinity. So what happens when religion becomes the authority? The Roman Catholic Church destabilized itself. It might have had a solid foundation in the resurrection of Christ, for as long as that could last, but two legs of the tripod that stood on that foundation had now moved dangerously close together, and the so-called Enlightenment was a tipping point. The early church fathers, of course, couldn't foresee this. They just needed some kind of dogma that enabled the church to interact with secular affairs. But it was around the same time that something more obviously pernicious occurred, the formalization of rewards and punishments to enforce the new transcendent authority. Arendt claims that it was from Plato that Dante took inspiration, and the Church accepted this model of heaven and hell as the method by which the uneducated masses could be persuaded to act as if they knew the truth. But this bolstering of authority came at a heavy cost to the religion itself. The Platonic predicament of authority was never solved, and so violence entered into the heart of the Church. This price is seen by illustrious Church fathers like Tertullian and Aquinas falling into the grotesque belief that one of the pleasures of heaven was to be able to watch the unspeakable sufferings in hell, speaking to the basest impulses of monotheistic exceptionalism. Overall, Arendt observes the incredibly sobering fact that, as far as religious thought is concerned, it is certainly a terrible irony that the glad tidings of the Gospels, life is everlasting, should eventually have resulted not in an increase of joy, but of fear on earth, should not have made it easier, but harder for man to die. But even Arendt seems to think that some mechanism of control was required, even if the church was an unsuitable bearer of authority. Separation of church and state removed eternal rewards and punishments from the political arena, and yet, contrary to that spirit, many post-Enlightenment revolutionaries still supported a fear of hell, seemingly out of a suspicion of human nature. Now, we must be careful. Arendt does not interpret this as an immorality of atheism argument. Loss of authority itself has led to atrocities in its name. Associating atrocities with the loss of religion is merely an artifact of religion's ill-fated attempt to assume authority in the first place. Atrocities occur when opportunists persuade an unwary multitude through cunning rhetoric. This is easily done in the name of religion or secular ideas alike. Arendt also dismisses any suggestion that it was the rise of new ideologies such as socialism or Marxism that led to moral corruption in a post-authority world. The problem is simply that, just as Plato's myth was too starkly manipulative to be politically effective, in the modern age, when all other religious dogmas are fading or hypocritical, the attempt to retain the fear of hell as a basis for morality is equally transparent. And so we come to the postmodern age, where Arendt says that traditional Western authority has come to an end. But what efforts are being taken to continue in the face of this? To review the why, Roman authority was instituted on the foundation of Rome and the Roman political trinity. Christianity formed a new foundation and unified the pillars of authority and religion, leading to a dangerous unbalancing of the trinity. And then finally, the Renaissance and the process of secularization delegitimized that religious worldview, unknowingly undermining political authority in the process. So now all Greek and Roman concepts underpinning authority have become platitudes. They are not compelling as vital aspects of our culture anymore. Foremost amongst these lost factors is the importance of foundation, which Arendt identifies as the single most important factor in establishing political authority. There is, she says, one pre-modern thinker who shows us this importance, and one political experience which demonstrates it. The thinker was Machiavelli, and the political experience, paradoxically, is revolution. Machiavelli never advocated for evil, he was simply against the political use of goodness, both the pragmatic good for and the Christian transcendent good. Both of these are useful in private interactions, but in the political context there is only fortuna and virtù, the circumstances into which the world throws us and our subsequent response to it. These two dynamic, self-perpetuating qualities define the political process, and this, combined with his deep enmity towards the Catholic Church, led Machiavelli back to the Roman foundation. And he decided first that a foundation could be proactively achieved, creating the modern idea of the nation-state, and then second, that violence is sadly inevitable in that foundation. Arendt looks at Machiavelli's belief that longevity in a state requires it to return periodically to its beginnings to overcome an inevitable process of corruption. But be careful, this is not simple conservatism. Virtù and fortuna ensure that the political experiences that led to the formation of a body politic will not be the same as those that can rejuvenate it. Machiavelli's ideas about revolution became a blueprint for later revolutionaries, Arendt citing particularly Robespierre in justifying the terror of the revolution. However, this innovation may also have been hubris because when they looked to a Roman foundation, they then accepted all means and including the means of violence, and there they appeal to Plato and so deliver themselves right back into the same predicament that Plato was unable to escape. The fall of the Roman political trinity has led to the so-called decline of the West, and all post-Enlightenment revolutions have attempted to reforge that miracle of permanence that the Roman foundation enabled. But due to the metaphysical baggage of the Christian era, due to the new cultural environment, due to a new fortuna unlike any other seen before, all of these attempts were doomed to fail, except one. Arendt claims that the only successful revolution was the American one, and in the deep dive I take issue with this characterization. To me, the United States used manifest destiny to prop up this apparent success, unexploited resources allowing the rapid expansion of a new body politic in an apparent new permanent foundation. However, this is reaching its limit, as we can see, and the old Platonic predicament is beginning to play out in the postmodern US just as it was faced in the old world. That's the end of the essay, and I will now repeat my answers to the three questions posed by Arendt at the end of part 1. First, what are the political experiences that correspond to and give rise to authority? In the West, the political experiences that lead to authority are those associated with the idea of expertise, of having someone who knows what must be done. Unfortunately, these self-same experiences draw us back to metaphors of the craftsman and violence. This is the great Platonic predicament. 2. What is the nature of a public political world constituted by authority? In an authoritarian society, the polity augments tradition through the creative act. Culture is preserved and added to and becomes the locus of history around which we operate. This cultural space allows remembrance and traces through time. Probably not in a pyramid, but that is our metaphor here apparently. Authority is bestowed in the praise we give to the augmentations of a culture, but who exactly deserves that praise? Arendt ultimately seems pessimistic about authority because of the uncontrollable waves of mass society and our loss of a firm pier to fix ourselves to. The ship of state seems destined to have no captain, and other mixed nautical metaphors. 3. What changed about the world when the modern age began to undermine the tripartite model of religion, tradition, and authority? Machiavelli, through his critique of the Catholic Church, enabled the idea of a revolution, a new foundation. In this sense, he was beyond the Romans, for whom there was only one foundation. But this commitment to the creative act of a future foundation led Machiavelli and later revolutionaries to accept violence in political change, culminating in Marx's choice to make it an explicit part of the historical process. And I will leave it there. I'm sure this summary has been quite long enough already, and there is the original deep dive if you want to know more. Thanks for watching this video. Stay tuned eventually for my final essay of Between Past and Future. Bye for now.